Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 19 of the Future of Work show. For those of you who've been following us, you might know that we've been having conversations with leading experts, academics, as well as practitioners on different topics around the future of work since June. And we've had discussions on topics as diverse as innovation, robotics, marketing, AI, analytics. But this month, the spotlight is on human resources. Our last conversation was with Krish Shankar, who is the Group HR Head of Infosys. And today I have a very, very special guest for you, Anna Tavis, Professor Anna Tavis of NYU, as we discuss performance management revolution. So thank you all for joining us. For those of you who are joining me for the very first time, my name is Shalini Lal, and I work at the intersection of people and organizations and the future of work. The work that we do at Uncube is largely a combination of advisory as well as educational. So, our Future of Work series is another attempt in this direction to explore ideas that are going to have special relevance for a future that's going to look quite different from anything that we've seen in the past. And now, let me bring on Professor Anna Tavis. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here.
No, thank you so much for joining. I know it's really early where you are at 7 a.m.
Exactly. 7 a.m. in the morning in New York.
Wow. And I must tell people that Professor Anna Tavis is a longtime yoga practitioner, meditation practitioner, and she is a frequent visitor to India. So we sort of got lucky because when we started talking about, performance management, we discovered that we actually had a lot of other interests in common. So I'm so delighted to have you here, Professor Tavis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Look forward to our conversation.
Me too. So my first question is actually around 2020 and what this year means for performance management. Are you hearing conversations around how organizations are going to conduct performance appraisals this year? What are the sorts of conversations and dilemmas that you're listening to this year, which is perhaps our most unusual year yet?
It's interesting to start with 2020, right? Because the big discussion, kind of macro level discussion that's going on now is whether to consider the pandemic a total disruptor that just a discontinuity with what we've done before, or the majority opinion is that it's actually an accelerator. I'm sure on your broadcast you've heard these concepts before. And what I want to say is, as far as performance management goes, I believe that it is a tremendous accelerator for the trends that have been already evolving for quite some time. And certainly for those organizations that have not started their transformation along the lines of modernization and optimization of performance management, that was a disruptor and a catalyst to be rethinking how we do performance management. So basically, that's kind of the framework in which I want to have the discussion today. It's both the accelerator of trends that we've seen before, as well as disruptor and catalyst for us to rethink performance management, not only for today, but also for tomorrow.
No, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And actually, my co-founder at Uncube is very, very fond of saying that the whole COVID disruption has, in fact, fast-forwarded the future. And I think that's something very similar to what you're also saying. And like you said, it's a sentiment which has been expressed by many other leaders in this field who are looking at what the impact of 2020 will be on several management trends. But as you can see, our conversation on performance management has actually attracted a lot of attention. And part of that is because of all the topics which come under the HR framework. Performance management is perhaps one that is one of the most complex and one which for the last at least 10 years has been up for some very fundamental discussions. Right from conversations around, early conversations were around bell curve, no bell curve, relative versus absolute performance, to then an annual appraisal versus, quarterly check-ins, formal versus informal, quantitative versus qualitative. So there have been so many fundamentally disruptive conversations around performance management, perhaps more so around performance management than maybe any of the other areas that come under the scope of the human resource function. You've written the article, a very, very well-read, a very, very popular article in Harvard Business Review, along with Professor Capelli, on the performance management revolution that speaks to some of these ideas. Would you be able to share with everyone who's joined us what these ideas and major forces leading to some of these, questioning of fundamentals in performance management actually are?
Thank you for this opportunity. What we started noticing around about 10 years ago are companies that started to question performance management as a kind of the through line that ran through most of human resources. What you've just mentioned here is performance management is central. Pretty much, it's the backbone of everything we do in HR. If you think about leadership development, if you think about compensation benefits, if you think about even recruitment and firing, it's all coming down to performance management. How people are being evaluated, what process do we take, who are the high performers, what percentage of people are not performing, et cetera, in the big conversation around ratings or no ratings. So this is why I believe that rethinking and understanding what performance management actually does for the business is absolutely central to anything that we do in HR. We can't be discussing even high potential culture or leadership development without understanding how these people perform in the organization and what performance management culture, mindset, philosophy the company has. So from that vantage point, I think it's really interesting to see that somewhere, again, about 10 years ago, and with some companies a little earlier, questions started to be raised around the whole cadence that we set up with goal setting in the beginning of the year, maybe in some companies mid-year review, but basically everything being placed just as you and I are speaking, sometime at the end of the year where people were evaluated, appraisal, which consisted of some level of self-evaluation that people presented around meeting their goals or not meeting their goals, and the manager review. And then those data that were collected at the end of this annual cycle pretty much determined the career path decisions, a lot of decisions that companies have made about individuals. So everything was hanging on the outcome of that one conversation a year with the manager. And even as the way I present it to you now, you can see the potential for breakdowns and the potential landmines along the way, and how this whole annual setup, annual scaffolding that we've built around performance can go wrong. And that's exactly what happened. Where it could go wrong, it went wrong. And all of those stories started to accumulate. And I think it also coincided, in our view, in addition to performance management article, we also were, Peter Capelli and myself, were the first ones who pointed out that HR was actually going agile, right? Mm-hmm. So it coincided with the agile revolution as the companies were actually on the business cycle, going away from the annual cycle and going in a much more shorter sprints, delivering outcomes, in the quarterly and sometimes even weekly way. And it all had to do with the technology. Underlying all of this was the technology development, software development that you're all familiar with, that actually, unlike the hardware, that you may operate with on an annual cycle, software, we constantly get updates on our phones, etc. Software is an ongoing process and it happens instantaneously. So all of these trends came together. In HR, we always get kind of accused of being too late, too little, too late. I think we were the last ones in this agile game when we realized that annual cycles don't work. There's a lot of subjectivity that's built into the performance appraisal. It's more of a political process oftentimes. And as the pandemic year demonstrated, setting goals in January and expecting that we have the same goals at the end of the year is pretty much unrealistic. It doesn't work this way. So these are the trends. We realize that we need to break down that system that we've built, and we need to rethink pretty much every aspect of it, from setting the goals. Do we set the goals or do we just prioritize things? Annual cycle, does that make sense? Should we be meeting and evaluating where we are on a more frequent basis? And most companies ended up with quarterly check-ins. And then the performance appraisal, that was one of the most important insights that we gained from looking at a whole number of systems, performance systems. The performance appraisal that was focused on the past and evaluating, judging people for what they've done rather than what they could do and how they could develop, was very much quite a demoralizing aspect of performance. And on top of everything else, because the goals were set in the beginning of the year, it was also getting in the way of innovation, because people were so focused on fulfilling the goals that were set a year ago that they were averse to experimentation. They were averse to trying new things. And they were pretty much very successfully gaining the system. So at the end of the year, when we do a realistic review of who's done what and how this, performance system actually performed, the ratings for that performance system were very, very low and negative. So that's a really interesting point where we found ourselves, because we decided that there's actually no one size fits all. We somehow all ended up with what actually was a GE process, right? A manufacturing process with this annual review, and how we all were doing performance management the same way because we thought that was the right way to do it. When we broke it down and kind of imploded it from within, and HR got a bit more realistic, creative, and data-driven, we decided that there are multiple ways in which you could do performance management, depending on the goals of the organizations, the business they're in, et cetera. So by the time the pandemic arrived, I would say that we already had pretty interesting blueprints of how performance management could be done when the annual cycle was unbundled and reviewed. And we had all of the ingredients, if the companies were not there yet. But by the time the pandemic hit, we had all of the ingredients to rethink how this system that is so critical and so central to HR could be reimagined, could be reframed to actually serve the needs of the organization and the needs of the people.
One of the really important points you bring out now, as well as in the article, is the complexity of performance management, because it's trying to do many different things at the same time. In your article, you emphasize the evaluative or accountability component of it, which is used for rewards, promotions, increments, talent cycle, variable pay, etc., etc. And then there is the learning and development component of it, which is, forward looking, and what is it that you can do better, differently today based on, where you are today. And you speak a lot to the tension between these two very different goals that are pulling in sometimes different directions. It also seems interesting that you spoke about GE right now, because GE, you're absolutely right, has been in a sense a sort of role model. And when they divided the whole performance appraisal process into these two very different components, one for talent development and one for evaluation, perhaps that was an early recognition of the fact that it's very difficult to have in one conversation do justice to both components of what a performance management system aims at. Do you think going ahead in the future, we're likely to see the paths diverge on both of these, that there will be, one process for rewards, promotions, increments, talents, which is quite different from a process for, coaching people in the here and now for what they need to do tomorrow, day after, and so on? Do you see these becoming two increasingly separate processes?
I think maybe initially it is a good thing to do, in as we are continuing to rethink the right way to do performance management. But I think eventually, when we are implementing those new technologies that currently exist, I think that the performance management as we know it now will become obsolete altogether, because where we are going now, I think you're familiar with, all AI and personalization technologies. We're going to be getting feedback right away on our projects, and I think Agile has moved us in that direction by saying, there are stand-ups that people do every day. How is it going every day? Every day they're receiving feedback, which is both evaluative, how we did, what's not going right, and the coaching, how we can correct it, right? So those two are kind of going to be merging at the point where, and that's a really, really critical idea about performance management, at the time where people can do something about it. Because, when you do the evaluative at the end of the year, you're going to be talking to people about something they've done in the course of the year, and there's no longer any way that they can correct it. So that's why it was so discouraging and so demoralizing when we actually look at the data coming out of all the performance reviews. And I think this is why it was the most hated HR process ever. Mm-hmm. It instead of being the most, the most constructive and most developmental. So I think by breaking down the process through the use of technologies in different ways of working into much smaller chunks, where the evaluation and the development happens at the time where the work is produced, right at that juncture, when people can actually say, okay, we did something wrong yesterday, we're going to shift and pivot the next day. So it kind of blends, evaluation, feedback, and ability to correct it, and the coaching built into this, right at the point where it happens. And it will be happening across the whole, let's say, annual cycle, if we want to refer to that, without waiting for, the end of the year. And on top of that, it's going to be personalized. As we know, the evolution of AI now, personalization, where, not only will we be able to look at our own data and our own performance just in time, we are also going to be delivered the resources that will help us correct what we need to correct in the moment when it happens. And on top of that, and that's actually a very big area of my interest right now, I now work on employee experience and do a lot of work in employee experience. You know, how, even the coaching will be delivered. You know, there are more and more platforms that emerge, and everything is going to be happening just in time. And the employees are going to be able to own their data. So one of the advantages of that type of setup is going to be, a lot more ownership that people are going to have over, their own results, their own development, because all the necessary information is going to be delivered to them through these different data points. And so, to a certain degree, some of that subjectivity that we've seen in the classic GE type of process is going to be, taken away, because it's not just going to be about the manager's impression of how you worked, but the actual results, the peer reviews, and multiple data points that are going to be fed into that in moment of evaluation and feedback, and the potential for correction, development, etc. So I think that that's what we're going to see, and it's very exciting and very encouraging to think that we're going to take all of that subjectivity, not all, but some of that subjectivity, and powerlessness. I think that's kind of the powerlessness and fear and anxiety associated with performance evaluations in the workplace.
That's so well said. I love your observation on the powerlessness and anxiety, because I think that's been true, ever since I've been a working professional, which is a long time. That every year there's an annual cycle, and there are a handful of people who know they're going to do really well, and it's a comfortable experience for them. But then for everyone else, it's almost like being back in school, where you're getting the grades to a test, and there's a lot that's riding on that, your career prospects within that organization, money, promotions, increments, etc., etc. I love what you said, Professor Tavis, about how the kind of role that data is going to play in the process, and a combination of data analytics technology allowing for multiple sources of data to come together on almost in a real-time basis, therefore taking away subjectivity and allowing for a more perhaps fair and transparent process in the end. If organizations still have an annual cycle for rewards, then allowing that data to feed into this. Are there any organizations today which are actually able to do this?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. There are two sides to it, because nothing is very simple and straightforward in HR, understandably. There's one aspect that I'm watching very closely, is the whole ecosystem of technology and companies that are working on these types of solutions, right? And what I am seeing is the technology is getting closer and closer. And I mean, if you think of our consumer experience out there, right? That, the point of sale, how much investment has been made to identify that particular moment for the consumer, and how much Amazon, and I don't know in India what you're using, but Amazon, yeah. How much Amazon knows about us, about our habits and all of this, so similar type of technologies are emerging. The ecosystem of these technologies in the AI and blockchains and various tools that are becoming available is already in place. Again, that's at the startup level and technology level. But then we get to the other side, which is us, humans. Are we ready to put that in? This is where the rubber hits the road. Change management, welcome to the human world. that is complex, resistant to change. There are all sorts of historical and legacy structures, so what I am seeing, the short answer to your question will be yes. I'm seeing companies moving in that direction and experimenting with these types of tools, but they're doing it very cautiously. So technology exists. It's about us thinking through what the upsides, downsides might be, and then changing the way we think about the workplace, which is probably the biggest obstacle on the way of really fully embracing these types of technologies in the workplace. And let me suggest a few barriers to change. And that's why, we not welcome, but the bright side of the pandemic is many companies were accelerated along those lines of change. But the number one priority for us is to figure out the ethics and the privacy. There are so much data. There's so much data that it will be available through these tools. And what we have not figured out as a society, I know these conversations are happening on a daily basis around who owns the data, who makes decisions about the data, et cetera. And as you know, there are differences even cross-culturally in how the Europeans look at their data privacy, and even the US that I'm familiar with. The good news is that the global companies are really going with the most strict, approach. Like all of our big companies, Microsoft and IBM, et cetera, they're going to go with GDPR. And they're going to, even in the US, follow the rules that the Europeans apply because they're global and they want to operate on that level. But I think because we are, and this is my, a conversation with our marketing colleagues all the time, because we are looking at much more complex issues in HR, we need to be a lot more cautious and a lot more mindful around how these types of technologies and how those, tools are going to be introduced and what kind of downstream effect they're going to cause in our system. So that's one area. The other area I would say would be leadership and management. A lot of our managers would feel that they're losing control, right? It's the sense of control. They want to control the team. They want to make decisions on behalf of the team. But if you're giving all the data to the people that they can make decisions on the ground, it's very disconcerting. A lot of managers are, maybe even if they say it's a good thing, they need to make that shift. And I'm sure you've heard in the context of the pandemic, now that everyone is working from home, managers cannot see their people because we're sitting at home. There's a lot of manager anxiety around, are people working? How do I know they're working? And this loss of control, I think, is one of the considerations we need to be thinking about, again, with the implications being the technology is going to disrupt the whole architecture of companies, control systems, governance, power structure in an organization, that we need to be very mindful of.
I think that's absolutely a brilliant point, Professor Tavis. The dilemmas around ethics and data. I'm sure you've seen some of the research on what future HR jobs are going to look like. And in almost every important piece of work around that, ethics always figures fairly high as a new skill which HR needs to develop, being able to think about data and the ethics around the use of data. Some weeks ago, we had Professor Joshi from IMD with us in a conversation around marketing AI and analytics. And he, in fact, proposed the importance of having a chief ethics officer in every organization who understands data analytics and, how best to protect consumers as well as employees and, their privacy, et cetera, so that organizations are more educated in what they do with data. So absolutely brilliant point. I think the second piece that you spoke about seems a lot harder to work around. What will happen to managers and leaders if in a sense it is data which is saying more than data has sort of the primary say in an evaluation. So what does that mean for a manager or a leader, and what does it mean for the kind of loss of control that they might have? How does it upset power hierarchy, and what are the implications of all of this in the future form of organization? I don't think we've been here necessarily before, ever. So I think those are really complex questions. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what such organizations of the future are then going to be like when one of the most fundamental sources of power of a manager is your ability to give you a certain performance rating at the end of the year, and therefore, sort of hold your future fortunes in their hands. So if that goes away, what does that mean?
No, I think and this is where there's going to be, it's happening now, a big kind of mindset shift around organizations, that we really need to be thinking about decision rights and how decision rights are distributed. And there have been experiments with holacracy, as you know.
Yes.
Zappos, who unfortunately just passed away. But I think we've learned a lot from those experiments, and they are very kind of illuminating. Number one, if you're looking at those success stories, number one priority for Tony when he set up Zappos culture was recruitment. As you remember, that he was handpicking people who were comfortable in the situations of high uncertainty. If you want to scale something like this, again, we're looking at psychological assessments of people, and we're looking at the range of need to control and need to have a structure. There'll be different psychological types. So, I can envision, and I think this is something that's already happening, where companies are beginning to select for culture. There's a lot of conversation around culture fit, and are we really injecting enough diversity into the culture, et cetera. But at some point, I think it's at a deeper level. It's not so much visible culture, but more around, our psychological needs and what kinds of organizations we want to work for. So again, as well as with performance management, I think we are going to see a diversification and a huge variation in the culture of companies. It might, to a certain extent, depend on what industry they're in. There's quite a bit of research done on national culture and how national culture affects people's preferences. So I think we're going to see a lot of focus and examination on, what people are, in what context people are most productive. And those will be leadership decisions. But it's going to be, as you know, a very gradual shift. And it's going to require some very interesting work on behalf of HR, who are going to be looking and working with their leadership to define those criteria and help, really shape the culture through various, not just tools and technologies, but also design of the processes, designs of the setups, and relying more and more on science to help us do that. One of the examples, as the important insights that neuroscience has brought to HR, for example, as well as behavioral economics. Our tools are going to get more subtle in helping people transition, as well as we're going to be focusing and leaning in more on the design of the whole architecture of their organization and deciding what companies, what cultures, what leaders we want to work for. So these are the types of markets we want to set up. But I don't want to say that all people who resist change are going to disappear. And I don't want to be just celebrating, holacracy type of organizations. I think there will be absolutely alternatives to that for people to choose from.
No, I think that makes sense. I think what I understand from what you're saying is that we're going to see a much wider spread in the way organizations are designed, because like Zappos, which you just spoke about, the holacracy experiment, or W.L. Gore's lattice experiment, etc., etc. There are these standouts who have designed themselves very differently, and they tend to share some things in common, like a lower power distance, a much more team-based operational style, much more fluidity in roles, but they've only stayed a handful in the last several decades. There've been these handful of organizations which absolutely truly committed to very alternative ideas around management and leadership, and they've used those ideas in one way or the other to design their organizations fundamentally differently from the hierarchies that are probably prevalent in 99.9% organizations in general. But what I hear you saying is that all of the changes that will happen in performance management because of the increased reach of data analytics and the possibility that lends might lead to a much wider spread in the way organizations themselves are structured, because the manager's role and the role of a hierarchy very fundamentally is called into question. So that is a very, very interesting observation. I'm just going to read some of the comments. Thank you guys for joining us, and I always love to read your comments. So Viplav says, hi, Dr. Amazing. Vijay says, superlative thoughts. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Viplav. Dheeraj, thanks for the thought leadership. Thanks, Dheeraj, for joining us. Jay Raman, how to go about when goal setting is not done during COVID period?
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, the goals, the goal setting has been questioned even before in organizations that have much faster cycles. It's still important to set priorities, and I think some of the companies, for example, IBM, they even changed the name of goals into priorities. It's important to set priorities, and the good thing about even semantically change that, what are our priorities for today, for example, right? It's easier to work around priorities because you can reprioritize the next day. So priorities change, whereas goals are a lot more, longer term. And in the pandemic, you should operate on priorities and call it priorities and say, for right now, here's our priority: to have everyone healthy. This is what the really caring organizations have decided. It's more important for us, even if we lose revenue, even if we slow down our production, et cetera, that all of our employees are, well taken care of and safe. So that's number one priority. It's not the business goal, clearly, but the management priority. And I think we're at the time still, until we're beginning to roll out the vaccine, but we're still at the time when we should be operating on priorities.
Very interesting. Let me ask a related question, Professor Tavis. Now, one of the roles which a formal, traditional performance appraisal process plays is also in, sort of bringing about alignment by cascading goals. And, there are many different formats with which that's worked, but alignment, organizational alignment, has been one goal, sometimes stated, sometimes not stated, of performance management systems as well. So, in the more fluid kind of performance systems that you spoke about, how do the two work together?
Okay. Alignment was an aspirational, I think, idea. And, subordinating the complexity of the business to this really very well balanced and nicely looking framework of alignment, I don't think worked out really well for a lot of companies. So again, I'm referring to more of an agile way of working. Alignment at the organizational level will not really work. I mean, and I will correct this in a minute. As far as the priorities are concerned, the unit of alignment and measure should be the team. That's what, or much smaller units that need to be aligned. If you're on the team, you need to be aligned around the goals. As Jeff Bezos says, it's a 2-pizza team. We even are beginning to find what is the optimal unit of measure in organizations. I think one of the things, just to make a comment about historical way we've done things and where we are going, we had 2 units of measure historically. We were measuring this kind of organizational level alignment, and we were also looking exclusively at the individual. This is how performance management was designed, etc. The environment we're moving into is going to be around teams. Team is the measure of the unit of measure for organizations, not individual, because we know individual works on the team and there's so much codependency for the projects, etc. And then it's also where a lot of times you have a finite project to deliver on the scale of the team. Organizations have multiple teams and multiple goals, and some of them might be, moving in very different directions. So I think shifting that measuring from individuals in bigger organizations, and everyone has to be kind of aligned in this, pyramid structure, to the ecosystem model where there are multiplicity of teams. The connecting tissue between all of them will be data and technology. Through data, through war rooms, through dashboards, you're going to be able to see and operate at the ecosystem level without necessarily aligning everyone around a cascade. You don't have to cascade goals. You're going to be seeing everything just in time. And what's really interesting, again, as an example, is what's happening with, for example, capturing the data from COVID. If you look at some of these dashboards, they're incredible. And they tell you that around the world, it's not the same, and you can see it all at once. You can make decisions based on this map of the world, the hotspots, the heat map. So we're going to be, because of the data collection, because of the technology available to us and visualizations that are available, we will actually be able to operate in this very complex environment and navigate it much more successfully than if we were insisting on some sort of artificial alignment and a streamlined architecture, just again to keep control of things, right? Because it all comes down to control. Do we have the organizations that are about control, or do we have organizations that are about succeeding, in the way that's kind of organic to the business and responding to the market as needed.
One of the interesting points that you made in some of your writing is the fact that, many of the early experiments happened in agile teams because their business itself had changed, and the unit of work is definitely the team there. The unit of the work is team for a few other kinds of teams as well, design thinking teams,
Yeah.
innovation. And this is a fundamental departure from the way organizations have traditionally been organized, where, back to 100 years ago, Frederick Taylor's ideas of division of labor, and what got counted as a team was not really a team at all, but just a set of people reporting into a common supervisor. That's, the word team was used rather freely.
Yeah.
But there haven't been too many organizations that have really embraced wholeheartedly the team as a unit, except till recently, when organizations which have adopted some of these methodologies for their core business itself have discovered that the complexity of issues at hand is far greater than what a set of individuals working parallelly can accomplish, and therefore it's the team which becomes the fundamental unit of performance and operation. And now you're saying that that is likely to be accelerated, the move from individual performance to team performance. Do you think that's something that will happen very easily, though?
Absolutely. I think we are learning more and more. I mean, surprise, surprise. I mean, it's really kind of obvious at some level that that we are social creatures. That even work is done and how we are motivated to do work and how we succeed and everything is codependent on the people around us. Even if we do individual work, the motivational side of individual work is very much dependent on, kind of that social environment. So we started talking about not just human capital, but social capital. And I think, again, getting back to technology, what the difference between before and after, talking about it before and how we're doing it now, is we actually now have a tool to measure it. When you can externalize and actually show to people that codependency, then it becomes tangible. It becomes it makes a lot of sense. And here I'm a very big fan of organizational network analysis, ONA, that exposes those connections. And there's been some fascinating research around. I know Boris Groysberg from Harvard did research on especially investment teams. The stars, chasing stars. How you take somebody who was successful in a certain context, you pluck them out of their context, you put them in another organization, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because all of that social support network, and everyone who's listening here who has ever been on the team or managed a team knows how much the team chemistry is responsible for the overall success of that unit. And obviously, a lot of times, what we do very unfairly, and it's back to performance management at a certain degree, that we ascribe that performance to the leader. That we're saying, look at what this leader accomplished. The leader's job is to facilitate the team. The accomplishment is the outcome of the team's work, and leadership is very important, but it's not the only thing that made that team successful. And I think we need to recalibrate a lot of our fundamental perceptions about performance and start really understanding better on that, that social capital, the importance of the team, and learn how to evaluate performance in the context of, a larger unit than just individual.
I agree. I also feel that it's going to be far more complex, really complex, because now we're sort of challenging the very heart of organization structures and leadership and hierarchy. So I think it's going to be quite challenging. So I'm going to take a few more comments. Lalit, good thoughts. Thanks, Lalit. Anurag, very true. Hi, Anurag. Thanks for joining. Innovation gets suppressed due to the overemphasized year-end performance goals. Absolutely. And I think OKRs were originally introduced with that intent, right? That, let people not play safe, let them, go for the moonshots and not restrict themselves to what will get them a good rating. Do you think that worked?
I think what's really interesting about some of the models, some of the OKRs, and a few other experiments. It works in some organizations. I think where, again, back to the importance of context, leadership, and a lot more factors for any model to actually successfully work. But I think what we often tend to do is to look at best practices without thinking about our own context and our own organization. And that's very often how it goes wrong. So I tend to be very careful about saying, here's the model, just take it off the shelf and put it into your company, and it's going to deliver magical results. I think we, again, with this diversification of options, and I think that really enhances the role of HR, where we need to be advising our leadership, who often just pick up the paper and they have a conversation at a leadership conference somewhere, and they hear that somebody does something, and they come back to HR and say, let's do it this way because it works for XYZ. I think nothing is going to work for us just if we look. It doesn't matter how well it works in other places. We need to look at it. We should consider it. We should break it apart, but we need to be very mindful about what we're bringing in. And OKRs can work. Let's try it out. Is there leadership support there? Are people bought in? The whole kind of change management aspect of it is absolutely critical. So again, I am not promoting any, and then that's the advantage of being an academic rather than a consultant or a provider, that I'm kind of looking at agnostically at different models and saying everything can work, but it won't work until you do your own homework.
No, and it makes sense. And I know that you've spoken about this in quite a few forums, the importance of moving away from the best practice format that HR has actually loved over the last many decades, and moving into a more design thinking based, what is it that will make sense here? And I know you've spoken about this in the IBM context, an organization you partnered with for their performance management system redesign. By the way, for all of those who are listening to us, if you want help in redesigning your performance management system or some ideas and are interested, do reach out to us. Professor Tavis has agreed to partner with us in these conversations, and we hope to be your, as she said, fair and disinterested partners. Anurag says, that's interesting, Anna. Feedback and performance coaching right at the point when it's needed. And I think that really does come to the core of what people want, right? When you ask, all the research around what people want from performance management is about, we want our managers to be coaches in some way. And that's what they're looking for.
Exactly. There's one aspect here that is often overlooked, and that is rewards and compensation. And I actually just wrote a couple of blogs on my LinkedIn around how we need to be very mindful about the rewards as well, because oftentimes we're saying, if we don't do performance management, how are we going to assign bonuses? How are we going to assign awards, etc.? And that is, again, thinking that this whole compensation, and rewards allocation is going to happen at the end of the year. So what I am seeing, and from research, and not only research, from parenting, we all know that the rewards have to come closer to the event that happened, as well as feedback about when somebody didn't do something right. That feedback is better delivered at the time when you can actually look at it and say, here's how you can improve. The same thing for rewards. If you've done something really, really exceptional, do you have to wait until the end of the year to be rewarded for it? When you actually did something and you could be rewarded right there, we are finding that that's a lot more effective. So I think one of the most, and I wrote about it, one of the most conservative parts of performance management and most difficult is to be thinking about the changes in the compensation system and how rewards are going to be allocated and when. And there are some experiments that are going on around also the frequency, and also how can you be rewarding people at the time of the event or right after, because that's when it becomes, and when I say reward, I don't necessarily mean financial reward, but any kind of reward. So anytime we want to be rethinking our performance system, we also, at the back of our mind, not just think about the feedback and what didn't work well. I call that system, if that's all you do, you're missing out on the biggest opportunity for performance management, and that is to reward the right people at the right time. And that is something that we need to be really mindful of and do right. And some companies are beginning to experiment with that, with the reward system, even financial reward system, spot bonuses, etc., set up on a much more frequent basis.
Won't that mean a big shift in employee expectations, though? Because, I mean, I'm sure in India, and I think pretty much all over the world, there is a sort of a cadence people are accustomed to, that there'll be an annual increment cycle of some kind, and whether people are happy or not, but there's like an expectation. So how do you think that will fit into what you're saying would be a more, as and when something happens, you give a spot kind of a reward?
I think it's the same as everything else around performance management, right? We are on track. We've been doing certain things, it's change management. Everything, that we've been doing eventually will need to be reimagined and reinvented. And the speed with which it's going to happen will depend on us. Everything we're talking about the future of work, et cetera, is already here. It's the biggest question about the future of work is how fast the humans are going to be accepting and adopting these types of technologies and different ways of working and thinking. And as we see how complex it is that the pendulum keeps swinging in different directions. As we are all celebrating, democratization and, decision rights being pushed down to the people and the teams, we see the pendulum swinging back, and lots of resistance. And I think that's the whole complexity of the future of work. If it were just for technology, that wouldn't have been a problem. But it is about, most importantly, changing human behavior at a scale that has not been seen before. And that's the biggest challenge.
That actually sums it up so well, because it is about, reimagining the future in ways that none of us have seen ever since the history of organization. And what is starting out as experiments in some organization will probably, as you suggest, pick up speed in many, many more organizations. And then we're likely to see this entire spectrum of a much wider range of approaches to organization, to the fundamental unit, whether it's team or the individual, and then the role that performance management itself plays, which is quite different from some of what we have seen. You are saying that the technology is ready or close to ready, and technology will not be the big barrier, but the barrier will be the imagination of what this might look like for your particular organization's context. I am conscious that we are at the end of your time, and I know that you have class to teach in Shanghai, so I won't keep you anymore. Really want to thank you so much. Performance management is perhaps one of the most complex conversations in the whole HR spectrum. And I think what I really, really enjoyed was your shedding light on what some of the future contours of both performance and organizations might look like. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and I hope to stay in touch. Thank you.
No, look forward. Thank you so much. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Professor Tavis is extremely accomplished in this field. Do follow her work. She's also one of the most eminent and leading thought leaders globally on the area of performance management systems. As she said, in case you're looking for support or partnership or even advice, to reach out to us. She's agreed to be a collaborator with us on that as we work on the future of work. As I mentioned right at the start, this month the spotlight is on HR, and our next LinkedIn Live is actually this Saturday with Arif Aziz, the CHRO of Diageo in India, and we're going to speak about the hyper-personalization of employee experience. Professor Tavis spoke about it very briefly, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what that might look like for many of our organizations. If you've been following our series on HR in particular, you're probably coming to realize that the future of HR and the future of organizations is going to look very, very different. And therefore, the skills that HR leaders themselves are going to need to be successful are going to look very different from what they've looked any time in the past. And I am happy to announce that Uncube is working on an HR leader development program that looks at some of these future skills, mindsets, attitudes, and fundamental understanding of the larger context in which HR will be operating, so that when you become an HR leader, you're able to take such decisions more consciously. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. If you liked this conversation, do share it on LinkedIn, comment on it, share it with friends who might benefit from it, share it with your organization. All recordings of past conversations are available on Uncube's website. And if you know any academic institution which might benefit from all these recordings, they're available free of charge to anyone who's curious about the future and interested in getting the mindsets and skills required to succeed in it. With that, thank you. Have a great evening and see you next time.